On the evening of May 25, 1942, aboard the towering flagship Yamato, Japan's most powerful warship, a celebration was underway. Officers in crisp uniforms raised their glasses, the air filled with laughter, music, and the smell of fine tobacco. On the surface, it was a night of triumph. The empire had spread its reach across Asia and the Pacific. Yet beneath the polished silverware and the carefully staged smiles, a far more dangerous reality was unfolding. For in those same hours, hidden in the shadows, an extraordinary gamble was being set in motion, one that would decide the fate of nations. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, believed he had devised a plan that would bring the United States to its knees in a single, decisive strike. But what Yamamoto did not know was that across the ocean, in a dimly lit room filled with humming machines and weary codebreakers, his secrets were already slipping into enemy hands. This is the story of a clash not only of fleets and firepower, but of deception, intelligence, and human willpower. And as the days of May turned to June, the Pacific would become the stage for one of history's greatest confrontations. Admiral Yamamoto was unlike many of his contemporaries in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Polished, cultured, with a taste for Western books and card games, he was both respected and resented. He had studied in America, lived in Boston, traveled through the oil fields of Texas, and walked the crowded streets of New York. He understood the industrial might of the United States better than most in Tokyo ever could. That knowledge haunted him. He knew that Japan's window of opportunity was narrow. If America were allowed to build, mobilize, and unleash its vast resources, Japan's empire would eventually crumble. The only hope in Yamamoto's eyes was to force a battle so crushing, so shocking, that Washington would lose its will to fight. And so, he planned what he believed would be the masterstroke, the destruction of America's aircraft carriers in a single, massive trap near a small, obscure atoll in the Pacific Midway. But this plan was no ordinary military maneuver. It was a symphony of deception, requiring secrecy, coordination, and flawless timing. Japanese forces would stretch across thousands of miles of ocean, feigning toward the Aleutians in the north, while striking toward Midway in the Central Pacific. The goal was simple in theory: lure the American carriers into the open, surround them, and annihilate them. Yet even as Yamamoto's officers toasted to their admiral's brilliance on that warm May night, the seeds of disaster had already been planted. Unknown to them, American cryptanalysts had begun to pierce the veil of Japan's most secure naval code. Every order, every movement, every whispered directive that Yamamoto believed hidden was now slowly being unraveled. Still, within the Yamato's grand chambers, Yamamoto remained calm, even pensive. He often projected confidence, but in private moments he revealed doubt. He had once admitted, almost reluctantly, that if the war dragged beyond 6 months, Japan's chances would diminish rapidly. And now, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, that moment of truth had arrived. The stakes were staggering. For the men in uniform aboard Japan's warships, the coming battle promised glory and honor. For Yamamoto, it was the only path to force America into negotiations. And for the world watching from afar, the outcome would shape the balance of power in the Pacific. Yet Yamamoto could not foresee how the United States, thought to be reeling, would respond. Nor could he imagine that a battle planned as Japan's crowning triumph would, instead, expose the empire's vulnerabilities in ways no one expected. Because in the shadows of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz was quietly preparing a counterstroke. With intelligence gleaned from broken codes, with commanders willing to risk everything, and with pilots whose courage outstripped their odds, the Americans were setting their own trap. The Pacific was vast, but it was shrinking by the day. Two mighty forces, one bent on conquest, the other on survival, were moving inexorably toward one another. And soon, their destinies would collide at a lonely speck of coral that few had ever heard of Midway. In the days after that glittering celebration aboard Yamato, the Japanese war machine moved with precision. Orders rippled across the Pacific, sealed in secrecy, cloaked in the language of their most guarded code, JN 25. From Tokyo, Yamamoto directed an operation so vast that it stretched belief. For aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, would strike Midway. Supporting them were battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, an armada the likes of which the Pacific had never seen. To distract and confuse, a second force would sweep toward the Aleutian Islands, threatening Alaska and pulling American defenses northward. It was a plan built on confidence, but also on arrogance. Yamamoto believed the Americans were still reeling, cautious, and blind. But in truth, his every move was being shadowed by men he could not see. At Pearl Harbor, in a cramped, sweltering room filled with cigarette smoke and the steady tapping of typewriters, a team of American codebreakers labored endlessly. Known as Station HYPO, they were led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, a man with a sharp mind and a sharper wit, whose rumpled bathrobe became as much a trademark as his brilliance. For months, Rockefort and his team had chipped away at Gen 25, the supposedly unbreakable Japanese naval code. Each intercepted message was like a shard of glass, useless alone, but when carefully pieced together, forming a window into the enemy's soul. And slowly, painstakingly, that window began to widen. The breakthrough came in May. The Japanese spoke of a target, AF. But what was AF? The analysts debated fiercely. Was it Midway? Or somewhere else in the Pacific? Rockefort devised a daring ruse. Midway's garrison was ordered to send an uncoded radio message complaining of shortage of fresh water. Hours later, Japanese intercepts reported that AF is short of water. The trap had worked. AF was Midway. The enemy's next strike was revealed. Back aboard his flagship, Yamamoto pressed forward, unaware that his elaborate deception had already unraveled. He believed surprise was on his side. He believed that by June, the American carriers would be cornered and destroyed. Yet at that very moment, Admiral Chester Nimitz weighed his options in Pearl Harbor. Calm, methodical, and deeply pragmatic, Nimitz saw opportunity where Yamamoto saw certainty. With the intelligence in hand, he decided not to defend Midway from afar, but to gamble. He would place his own carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, in ambush, lying in wait northeast of Midway. It was a breathtaking risk. Outnumbered, with carriers still damaged and aircrews untested, the Americans would face the full might of the Japanese fleet. Yet for Nimitz, the alternative was worse: to fight blind, without initiative. Better to strike with surprise than to cower with hesitation. As May slipped into June, the Pacific began to churn with movement. Japanese task forces sailed confidently, their decks lined with aircraft painted with the rising sun. Pilots, some veterans of Pearl Harbor, polished their goggles and checked their weapons, convinced that another easy victory lay ahead. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor, sailors worked day and night to patch the Yorktown, a ship battered at the Coral Sea only weeks before. Welding sparks lit the night as crews repaired her flight deck in record time. In 72 hours, what should have taken months was accomplished. When she steamed out of port to join Nimitz's ambush, her decks still smelled of fresh paint. The contrast could not have been sharper. Japan's fleet moving with confidence, certain of its prey. America's fleet moving with desperation, clinging to fragile hope. And yet, fate was already tilting the scales. Every intercepted message, every decision made in Rockefort's cluttered office, every sleepless night spent parsing codes, had pushed the Americans closer to parity. The Japanese thought they held all the cards, but they were playing against an opponent who had already seen their hand. The stage was set. Two fleets, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, were now drawn toward the same tiny atoll. The trap Yamamoto had built was real, but it was no longer his. The Americans had quietly claimed it as their own. What neither side yet realized was that in just a few days, the skies above Midway would turn into a maelstrom of fire and smoke, where destiny would be decided not by admirals and distant flagships, but by young pilots hurling themselves into battle with almost no chance of return. On the morning of June 3rd, 1942, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a pale sky, calm and deceptively peaceful. But beneath that calm War was converging. Japanese carriers steamed eastward, their decks crowded with sleek bombers and fighters. In the distance, destroyers cut sharp wakes, their crews alert, their confidence unshaken. To them, this was another Pearl Harbor waiting to happen. But beyond the horizon, unseen, lay a force they did not expect. 3 American carriers, battered, outnumbered, but invisible, were waiting like predators in the deep. The stage was set. The silence of the Pacific would soon be shattered. At dawn on June 4th, Japanese aircraft roared off the decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their target, Midway itself. Bombs rained down upon the tiny atoll, blasting fuel tanks, igniting buildings, and sending plumes of black smoke curling into the sky. For the men stationed there, it was hell unleashed. Yet the garrison fought back, scrambling outdated fighters and manning anti-aircraft guns. Midway burned, but it did not fall. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier force, now faced a critical decision. His pilots radioed back. Midway was damaged, but not destroyed. Should he send another wave? Or should he prepare for the possibility of American carriers nearby? Unaware that his every move was already compromised, Nagumo hesitated. His decks became chaos as aircraft were rearmed and refueled, bombs and torpedoes scattered like tinder. It was a moment of indecision that would prove catastrophic. While Japanese decks swarmed with confusion, American patrol aircraft from Midway spotted the enemy fleet. Reports crackled over radios, carrying coordinates that confirmed what Nimitz already knew. The Japanese were exactly where the codebreakers had said they would be. From the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, American squadrons launched into the sky. Pilots, many barely trained, climbed into their cockpits with a grim determination. They knew the odds. They knew the enemy was stronger, their aircraft superior. Yet they flew anyway, engines thundering as they climbed toward destiny. The first to find the Japanese carriers were the torpedo squadrons. Flying obsolete planes, slow and underarmed, they dove straight into the storm. Wave after wave of Japanese fighters tore through them, machine guns shredding the fragile aircraft. Entire squadrons were wiped from the sky. Pilots died without scoring a single hit. But their sacrifice was not in vain. As the Japanese combat air patrol chased the torpedo planes low over the waves, the sky above opened for another strike. From high altitude, American dive bombers suddenly appeared, dropping from the heavens like avenging angels. With decks cluttered by rearming aircraft and fuel lines snaking like fuses, the Japanese carriers were exposed. In a matter of minutes, the balance of the Pacific shifted. Bombs tore through the flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Explosions ripped their hearts open, flames consuming planes and crews alike. Within hours, 3 of Japan's prize carriers were mortally wounded, their great hulks burning on the ocean surface. The Japanese had set a trap, but it was they who had been caught. Yet the battle was not over. From the surviving carrier Hiryu, Japanese pilots struck back with ferocity. Twice they hit the Yorktown, leaving her a burning wreck. Her crew fought valiantly, saving her again and again, but the damage was too great. Eventually, she slipped beneath the waves. Still, the Americans pressed forward. Later that same day, dive bombers found Hiryu and delivered the final blow. By nightfall, all 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, the same ships that had struck Pearl Harbor, lay destroyed. The Empire's spearhead was broken. As flames lit the night sky, Admiral Yamamoto received the news he had dreaded. His grand strategy, his gamble to end the war in a single stroke, had collapsed. He ordered the remnants of his fleet to withdraw. The ocean that had promised victory now carried only defeat. For Japan, Midway was more than a lost battle. It was the loss of irreplaceable carriers, trained pilots, and above all, the initiative in the Pacific. For the United States, it was a turning point, proof that courage, intelligence, and sheer resolve could overcome even the greatest odds. And so, the tides of war shifted. The empire that had swept across the Pacific now found itself on the defensive. The Americans, bloodied but unbroken, would never again yield the initiative. The story of Midway is not merely one of ships sunk and planes destroyed. It is the story of men, of Yamamoto, brilliant yet fatally overconfident, of Nimitz, calm and calculating, of pilots who flew into near-certain death so that others might succeed. It is the story of how, in just a few hours, the course of a world war was changed forever. And it all began with a celebration on the Yamato, a night of triumph that masked the shadow of coming ruin. The smoke of Midway lingered far longer than the flames. For days, oil slicks drifted across the Pacific, carrying with them the shattered remnants of once mighty carriers and the bodies of those who had gone down with their ships. The battle was over, but its echoes would resound for years. For Japan, the losses were catastrophic. For fleet carriers, the very ones that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor gone, with them perished hundreds of elite pilots and deck crews, men who could never be replaced quickly enough. The Imperial Navy still had battleships, cruisers, and submarines, but without carriers and the air wings to fill them, its striking power had been gutted. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had once walked the decks with quiet confidence, now found himself confronting the nightmare he had long feared. He had warned his country's leaders that 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's chances would begin to fade. Now, almost to the very day, that prophecy had come true. From his flagship, Yamamoto ordered the withdrawal. The vast armada he had assembled retreated in fragments, scattered and demoralized. For the first time, the Japanese Navy tasted not merely defeat, but humiliation. Meanwhile, in Washington and Pearl Harbor, the news spread like wildfire. After months of despair, the shock of Pearl Harbor, the fall of the Philippines, the surrender of Singapore, the tide had turned. Newspapers proclaimed Midway as a miracle, a triumph of courage and intelligence. But Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the truth. Victory had been razor-thin. Had the codebreakers failed, had the torpedo squadrons not sacrificed themselves, had a single bomb missed its mark, the story could have ended very differently. Midway was not only a victory of steel and gunpowder, but of men who dared to act against the odds. For the pilots who returned, the cost was deeply personal. Out of entire squadrons, sometimes only a single man limped back to base. Survivors spoke of friends who had vanished into the ocean, of burning skies, of the deafening roar of anti-aircraft fire. They carried scars, both seen and unseen, but also the knowledge that their sacrifice had changed history. Strategically, Midway marked the turning point of the Pacific War. Until then, Japan had expanded relentlessly, conquering territory with little resistance. After Midway, the initiative shifted. No longer would the Imperial Navy dictate the terms of battle. From this moment on, it would be America that pressed forward, island by island, battle by battle, pushing Japan back toward its homeland. Psychologically, the impact was immense. For the Japanese public, news of the defeat was carefully concealed, softened by propaganda. Yet within the corridors of power, the truth was undeniable. The aura of invincibility had been shattered. Officers whispered doubts. Some even questioned the wisdom of Yamamoto's strategy. For the Americans, Midway became a symbol of resilience. It proved that even in the darkest hours, when the enemy seemed unstoppable, resolve and ingenuity could alter the course of war. It was a victory that inspired a nation and gave hope to allies across the globe. In the months that followed, Yamamoto himself would remain at the helm, still commanding respect, still carrying the weight of his nation's hopes. Yet even he seemed changed. His letters grew somber, his once bright confidence dimmed by the knowledge that the balance had shifted against him. Less than a year later, he would meet his own end in the skies over the Solomon Islands, hunted down by American aircraft, guided once again by the very intelligence network that had doomed him at Midway. And so, the admiral who had engineered the surprise at Pearl Harbor and the grand gamble at Midway became, in the end, a casualty of the very forces he had underestimated. Midway remains more than just a battle. It is a reminder of how wars turn not only on weapons, but on decisions, on intelligence, on courage and sacrifice. It is a story of pride and hubris, of endurance and resolve. The Pacific is vast, but in those days of June 1942, its fate was decided on a tiny atoll, a speck of coral where thousands risked everything, and where history itself took a new course.